as upset, though, as the New York Times, like 6-page article,
Yeah,
7-page article.
This is huge.
On conditions inside Foxconn and basically a larger story about the conditions around building consumer electronics, which has been this like bubbling up thing for a long time. But this is an upsetting read and really important.
I think you guys should all check this out. It addresses more specifically in this article. It talks about Apple's dealings with manufacturers like Foxconn and suppliers and how they've dealt with the conditions inside of there. Now, they do point out, and we all know that Foxconn does supply products, final goods for a variety of companies like HP, Lenovo, IBM. But this is kind of the focus on this specifically with Apple is we've heard about, how there was that explosion, I think maybe somewhere around 4 to 5 months ago at one of their factories where 4 people died, but also just the overall trend of how much are they really doing to change and make improvements. Because you have here on one side, Apple just reported their earnings, and if you know or read those, they were off the charts. It was $43 billion in revenue, $13 billion net revenue, record sales for iPads, Macs, and iPhones, all right? So you see these numbers, and Wall Street is just blown away by them. But there's a cost that's involved in this, and this is the human cost in these products. How hard are they working, these people? What are their living conditions really like? In this article, the New York Times goes on, and like we said, it's a long 6-page article. They talk about how Apple was, once it was brought to their attention, Apple was one of the first companies that said, okay, we're going to do audits of these suppliers and factories and talk about and point out where they have violations, whether it's underage workers, people working over 60 hours a week, 6 or 7 days in a row, how long are their shifts. So Apple has tried to send out reports of suppliers and companies that are violating these policies.
The problem
even at that, though, right?
Right.
The problem is, although they are mentioning these, they have in their contract, Apple says they have the right to terminate their contract agreement with any supplier that violates these policies. Well, the ratio of actual suppliers they've terminated versus the violations across the board is
it's terrible.
There's no parity there.
They said they've terminated maybe 17 people. All of the contracts remain in place. And these are audits, by the way, that have been happening in some form since 2005. They got a lot more serious in 2007. But a lot, this article quotes several former Apple executives as saying, look, if we wanted this stuff to stop, it would stop. They're finding violations every single year in the audits, including dozens, as many as 70 in one case, what they call core violations, which are violations that involve hiring underage workers, and improperly disposing of toxic waste, forcing people to work in patently unsafe conditions. And it's sort of like they just write a story about it every year, but the problems don't go away. And it's really, certainly the Times takes care to point out that this is an industry-wide issue, but it does sound like other companies, HP, Dell, Lenovo, do a better job in some cases of terminating those contracts. But Apple has created such a cycle of constant releases, and they've created such a consumer expectation, and they squeeze their margins so intensely.
That's always been their way.
That's always been their way.
Always been their way.
And so there are several experts quoted in this article saying, let's be realistic. There's no way that Apple is going to terminate a contract with Foxconn.
Yeah.
That is not going to happen. And there's no way that Foxconn or any other Apple supplier has incentive to treat their consumers well, because they have to cut costs at every single corner.
And here's another thing. We talk about Apple's secrecy as a company. And one of the issues that these reports have shown is that Apple will name these factories and suppliers, but not where they're located. Because of the level of secrecy, when these suppliers sign agreements, if you're a supplier in China and all of a sudden you're like, wow, we're making parts for Apple, we're going to have this huge contract, and you sign a confidentiality agreement that says you can't reveal that Apple's one of your partners. In the reports, Apple doesn't reveal where you're located because of the secrecy. That culture of secrecy is going to permeate this, and also we don't know everything that's really happening at these factories. You can't even find all of these factories and know who's doing what. And because of that culture of secrecy, that's another reason why it's very hard to shed light on this, and that's not a good thing. That's a horrible thing.
And honestly, when I think the most enraging quote of all to me in the story was someone who said consumers demand new products every year. That was such horse crap. Like, no, they don't, right? marketing and a constant release cycle has convinced consumers that they can expect these products every year. But that is solely so that companies can make money. It's not like I'm sitting here going like, if I don't have a new iPhone every year, I will just die. I will just not make it. I mean, that is something that has been conditioned. That's a cart before the horse kind of argument. And the fact that Apple is sitting on an unbelievable cache of money, that they made $13 billion in
For the
pure
core
profit.
net revenue, my friends.
That was the pure profit part of their earnings. The fact that they can't spend money, and by many accounts in this story, they have been warned very specifically about safety issues and violations and not responded. In fact, they say 2 weeks before the Foxconn explosion, a report was sent to Apple warning of unsafe conditions. And according to almost all of these reports, Apple just did not respond.
Yeah. So the takeaway of this is that, as a consumer, how much do you really care about the device? Because we've seen how in the past sweatshops with Nike and Gap and other clothing industries, people have made noise and protested against these companies for their practices. Are we, as a collective group, we need to do the same thing with these tech companies and hold them accountable? Because I'm sorry, I don't want to know that someone potentially died at the hands of creating my phone. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. So it's really up to us to start realizing that, hey, this thing that we have isn't as important as these conditions that we care about. And, Foxconn has some factories here in the U.S., but one of the other challenges is that obviously the laws and what's morally acceptable in one country for workers' rights is different than what's here in the U.S., but it doesn't mean that we should overlook it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So,
and to Microone, who's asking in the chat room, why are we only talking about Apple? We mentioned earlier that HP, Lenovo, many other electronic companies do business with Foxconn. None of them do business on the scale of Apple, and none of them make as much money off of these business practices. I mean, somebody in the chat room just pointed out, Curtis B, it was the fourth best profit report, this fourth quarter thing, of all time. They're basically up there with the oil companies in terms of pure profit. They have the muscle and the market power to make a huge difference here. They've known about these problems for years and they haven't done anything about it. They're like the McDonald's, right? Like when McDonald's said, okay, we're going to stop. McDonald's had a huge impact on the beef industry and the way that cows were being treated, basically, because they said, okay, due to market pressure, we don't want to, have things be as inhumane as they have been. Apple's McDonald's in this situation, and they need to be the ones to do something about it.
Here's the way to look at this realistically. If let's say 30 to 40% of all iPhones that came out of these factories were defective, Apple would do something to stop them from being defective, whatever those procedures or conditions are. So Apple should realize, if that's what's happening with their phones and how they react, they need to react the same way with the conditions for these workers.
Yep.
When the first issues were brought up about workers being underpaid and overworked, I remember Apple went and did an audit and they gave a general raise to some of the workers. But that doesn't address the conditions, right? The systematic problems that are happening over in these factories. So really, if Apple wants to stand tall and look like the good guy within the next 6 months, 2 years, I don't know. I hope they address this because Tim Cook, his history, his genius or one of his strengths was dealing with the supply chain,
right? The
efficiencies of it, the margins. So he knows what's going on.
I find that really fascinating too, because in some ways Tim Cook is coming out as the good guy, right? Like he restored charitable giving matching at Apple, or introduced it for the first time, something that Steve Jobs resisted. He is now giving Apple employees a big discount on buying their own products. Like, he in some ways seems like this really great guy, but he is the guy who set up these manufacturing arrangements. It's on him. Like, it's actually on him personally, I think, in a lot of cases, to take care of this, to deal with this. And I think that and that's why we're spending so much time talking about it, because it is really important. And like Brian pointed out, the consumer can have a big difference here.
Huge
it's
impact
happened in
here.
the past, and there needs to be outcry about this. It's not acceptable for people to die for your iPhone. It's just not.
So I've got to imagine with this long article that's going to get a lot of play, that we're going to hear something, in the near future from Apple.
Right.
They're not going to just sweep this one under the rug. So
totally. And we're not either.